Over the last 40 years, the second largest economy in the world has transformed itself from a poverty-stricken country with miserable living conditions to a rich urban metropolis that has become a manufacturing superpower. Its transformation story might be the best I've ever seen. However, that dominance is now under threat. Behind the continued success of its mass production factories that created a third of all available goods in the world, the country is unfortunately regressing towards an increasingly hostile rule that has already caused companies to look elsewhere and move their factories to countries that offer cheaper labor, more favorable trade policies, and better relationship with foreign countries. Although, that can change. This is not even mentioning that the cost of producing in China is no longer significantly lower than in Western countries, and an increasingly aging and shrinking population meant that China would only get less and less attractive for companies to center its production on, especially those that heavily rely on lots of cheap labor. Now, this is not exactly a bad thing. In fact, it can be an opportunity for China to transition itself from a developing country to a fully developed country, move up the value chain to exclusively manufacture higher quality products, and leave the work of cranking out cheap, labor-intensive goods to others, basically transforming itself from made in China to made by China, graduating from the world's factory to the world's R&D lab. So, how did China rise to become the world's main factory? What are the main threats to China's competitive advantage in manufacturing? How all of this can actually be good for its own economy? And lastly, if China is not the world factory anymore, who will replace its role? A bit of spoiler, in the ideal scenario, China itself should be able to replace China. Alright. So China's manufacturing industry started to blossom around 40 years ago, when the country began to open up its economy under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, who introduced the concept of free market to China for the first time. Up until that point, the Chinese economy was poor, stagnant, vastly inefficient, fully controlled by the government, and isolated from the global economy. But even when the economy was absolutely horrible, China always had a decent industrial base. Why? Well, because China during the Mao era valued self-sufficiency above all else. He believed that China should not depend on foreign trade, but instead building up its own industry and produce everything at home. In theory, China is the ideal country for this. It had plentiful labor, lots of factories, and China was, and still is, one of the world's largest producers of coal, gold, aluminium, steel, and iron ore, which made it easier to produce everything at home since most of the raw materials were already there. The problem with China before its economic reform is not that they didn't have factories, resources, or the manpower to make stuff. It's just that production was extremely inefficient and wasteful. The factories were often overstaffed, underfunded, and rotten with corruption. The equipments were outdated, and the central planning system could not keep up with the changing needs and preferences of the consumers. Sometimes they produced too much stuff that ended up rotting in the warehouses, or produced too little that would create long lines of people. Not to mention, this very policy contributed to massive shortages of food that led to the deaths of around 10 to 40 million people, the deadliest famine in human history. The point is, China always had great economic potential, but it wasn't properly used. So, when the reforms happened, all of a sudden, China became the perfect place to outsource manufacturing, as it has an excellent combination of lax regulations, low taxes, lots of resources, and access to the world's largest and youngest workforce that demand low wages. In 1982, China became the first ever country to have a population of more than 1 billion people. At the time, the average Chinese worker earns between $416 to $508 per year, while the average American earns 40 to 50 times more than that. This was the biggest draw for global companies to set up production in China, but to its credit, China really did fully capitalize on this advantage. For example, China began establishing special economic zones that had market-friendly policies. At that time, China was still hesitant to embrace capitalism, so it tested capitalism on several cities and slapped low taxes, relaxed regulations, and invited foreign investors to those cities. With these reforms, then came significant growth, and China began applying its market-friendly policies to every major city. Today, China is a manufacturing powerhouse that has several giant manufacturing hubs, each one specializing in various parts of the supply chain. For example, Guangdong focuses on electronics, the eastern provinces near Shanghai specialize in daily goods, mechanical parts, and medical equipment. Meanwhile, Wuhan and Chongqing are both known for their production of chemical products and auto components. Now, unfortunately, when we look at the present moment, a lot of things that helped China's industry to become what it is today just don't exist anymore. Some through their own undoing, but mostly it's just economics. Let's look at the most obvious problem first. China is aging, faster than almost all other countries in modern history. By 2035, an estimated 400 million people in China will be at age 60 or over, or about 30% of the entire population, according to the Chinese government's own projections. 2022 was the first time that China's population declined since 1961, and the downturn will be long-lasting and likely irreversible. It goes without saying that one of China's biggest advantages in the 1980s wasn't just it had the biggest population, but most of the population was in or about to enter their prime working years. In 1980, 75% of its population was below 40 years old. In the year 2000, the age bracket with the biggest number is between 25 to 34 years old. What about 2023? Well, the age bracket with the biggest population is between 50 to 59 years old. Fast forward 10 years time when most people in this age bracket retires, and there will be big problems. Another way we can look at China's aging problem is by measuring its age dependency ratio, which basically measures how great a burden is placed on people of the working age, aka adults, by those of non-working age, aka children and retirees. In 2022, China's age dependency ratio is at 46.6, which means that for every 100 people of working age, more than 46 seniors and children had to be supported. The higher the number, the more retirees will be waiting for Social Security, which there will be fewer adults left to pay for, which in the extreme worst case scenario can cause total social collapse. Ironically, the Chinese government only got themselves to blame for this, because the shortage of children that it has right now was preceded by 3.5 decades of the one-child policy. After countless unnecessary deaths, China relaxed the rule to allow 2 children in 2016 and later to 3 children in 2020. But guess what? Most couples choose to have 1 child anyway, and birth rates continue to decline. Now, going back to the age dependency ratio, China's ratio has steadily increased over the years, as you can see here, and it actually bumped up quite massively in 2020, which kind of implies that most of the pandemic victims in China are people in the working age bracket. It's a sad and unfortunate setback that China might just never recover from. Of course, to defend China, you could argue that 1, this is a long-term problem and will not affect China's industries in the short term. And 2, the impact of population aging can be less damaging if it is offset by growth in labor productivity and wages. This is actually my main argument as to why China needs to transform its economy and move up the value chain. So, we'll look at this in detail later. Another problem that China has is higher wages. Of course, higher wages are mostly good for the economy, as when wages go up, people tend to buy more stuff or invest it in the stock market, for example, which in turn can see companies increase production, hire more people, and pay better wages, creating a vicious cycle of economic prosperity. But if this trend continues, low-cost manufacturing, which has been China's bread and butter for the last 40 years, will experience a decline sooner than later. Not only because companies can afford it, but also because as more people overcame poverty and the Chinese middle class has seen incredible expansion, assembly line jobs are just not as attractive as they once were. This has caused factory managers to raise wages and Chinese local governments to steadily increase the mandated minimum wage. This is great for the people of China, but it prompted companies that prioritize cheap labor to search for alternatives. Vietnam especially has benefited largely from this. It had cheap labor costs, stable politics, with a young and increasingly educated population. Now, it is important to note that most companies that benefited from leaving China are businesses that had low margins and desperately need cheap labor in order to be profitable. But for a lot of other companies, the cost associated with leaving China is still too high, at least for now. The reason is pretty simple. China has mastered the craft of manufacturing. Although its workers are more expensive than those in Vietnam, Mexico, or Bangladesh, they are also more productive simply because they have been doing it for more than 30 years. Let's imagine the production of a hoodie, for example. Seems less complicated than producing semiconductors, but it's not just about the textiles needed to cut and sew into a hoodie. It is also about the trims, dies, zippers, cords, and other necessary pieces that are built in different places and require multiple suppliers. Believe it or not, producing a hoodie or a baseball cap is still pretty complex. Of course, not as complex as making an iPhone, but still pretty complex nonetheless. China has deployed a strategy that ensures the entire manufacturing supply chain is located there, and they have mastered each step of the process. China even imports and processes much of the world's wool and cotton, importing US-made cotton, which makes up 35% of all cottons on Earth. If a US retailer wanted to move the production of the textile it sells out of China, it would have to move the entire ecosystem with it. Either that, or it will need to source the inputs needed from China into other countries like Vietnam or Bangladesh, where the product would then be made. Sure, China is aging, its labor is getting more and more expensive, trade relations are concerning, and even without all of these problems, companies around the world are looking for alternatives simply because it's too risky to base your entire production in a single country. But at the same time, there is no country on Earth that could match China in terms of its business ecosystem, and unlike cheap labor, this is much harder for other countries to replicate, as they are literally decades behind. China needs to transform its manufacturing industry, move up the value chain, and attract companies that rely not on cheap labor but on skilled labor, which China does have. Relying on cheap labor alone is not sustainable, and their industries will slowly die out as there are many more countries with even cheaper labor. However, growth from higher quality manufacturing is more sustainable, with higher profit margins and less controversial as well. For the past 10 years, there have been lots and lots of news reports coming out of China about the inhuman treatment of workers. Things like forced labor, non-existent safety protocols in factories that led to accidental deaths, low pay, and a typical to downright crazy working hours. All of them with dire consequences for both physical and mental health of workers. I don't mean these problems don't exist in richer companies that pay higher wages to their workers, because every profit-making entity loves to cut costs. That's just the reality of capitalism. But generally, workers with higher wages do have better working conditions, and are not afraid of switching jobs if they want to do so. This will help to limit the damage of China's aging population as well. As I said before, aging population is an irreversible problem. And China is the best example of how even a powerful, controlling government could not fully control the people's culture and decisions. What they can control better, however, is increasing its labor productivity so that even when the population is rapidly decreasing, economic output can be sustained as workers produce more stuff, earns higher wages, and spend more of that wages towards the economy, transitioning China from a country relying on overworked cheap labor to skilled labor that consumes more stuff, making everyone else better off. How can a government do all of this? By providing tools, equipment, and facilities that workers can use to produce goods more efficiently, increasing the quality of education, investing in R&D, improving working conditions, and maintaining its world-class infrastructure. If all of this is successful, there will be no more made in China, but made by China. And it will be able to build its own branding instead of selling its products as a generic commodity. Apparently, the Chinese government knows all of this, and if all the news reports I'm reading are true, well, it will be pretty encouraging indeed. Alright, so after going through all of that, let's try to answer a hypothetical question, just for fun. If China's plan of moving up the value chain is successful, who will replace China as a low-cost manufacturing facility? Well, first of all, before we talk about other countries, there is a possibility that China itself could replace China. This can happen because China as a country is unevenly developed, with most of its labor-intensive manufacturing concentrated in big cities, while small cities still mostly rely on agriculture. It could be the case that China's countryside and smaller cities that do have cheaper labor take up low-cost labor-intensive manufacturing, while the big cities handle higher quality manufacturing. This is what I mean by China itself can replace China. In fact, this exact phenomenon has happened in the USA before, as after World War II, a lot of manufacturing migrated from the bigger cities to smaller cities around the country, enabled by the spread of interstate highways. Because of this decentralization, states like Texas and Florida saw growth in their manufacturing industry. Perhaps the same could happen to China. Now, aside from China itself, perhaps the most obvious contenders to fill the gaps are emerging countries that have a high share of labor-intensive exports in Asia. India, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam all came to mind. Out of all these countries, only Bangladesh and Vietnam have grown massively in terms of low-cost manufacturing. Today, Bangladesh is the world's second largest clothing exporter because of its extremely low costs. China is still the first though, and Vietnam has been the favorite alternative to China for shoe production. But the problem is, they are just not big enough to fully take over China's production. Bangladesh and Vietnam's population is around 265 million people combined, which is still less than 20% of China's population. If we're strictly talking about population, there's India with its 1.4 billion people. But does India have enough in terms of labor-intensive manufacturing? For now, I don't think so. But it is still a country with much room for growth, and India probably has the biggest potential to replace China. The case is even less compelling for other countries in Europe or Africa. Countries like Romania, Morocco, and Tunisia are all just behind in terms of labor-intensive manufacturing. Okay, so one last question. If no one replaces China, what then? If costs keep rising in China and companies don't leave, what will happen? Well, the logical answer is that products like shoes and clothes will be more expensive in the future. We have been accustomed to low prices for many labor-intensive goods because of cheap labor. Fast fashion, for example, is a thing because of China. So, it is likely that prices have to adjust. This is Doverhill, and see you next time.